The rain fell in thick sheets over Willow Creek, Colorado, on that bitter April evening in 1873. But Katherine Flynn refused to move from her position on the porch of the small homestead. 3 weeks had passed since Henry had promised to return with supplies and money from his business venture in Denver. 3 weeks of dwindling food, of explaining to curious neighbors that everything was fine, of watching the horizon with diminishing hope. The water dripped from the brim of her sodden bonnet as thunder rolled across the darkening sky. Her blue cotton dress clung to her slender frame, but still she stood, scanning the muddy trail that led to their property. Another flash of lightning illuminated the countryside, revealing a lone rider approaching through the downpour. Katherine's heart leapt, but only for a moment. Even from this distance, she could tell it wasn't Henry. This man sat differently in the saddle, broader-shouldered and more upright than her husband's perpetually slouched posture. "Mrs. Flynn," the rider called out, pulling his horse to a stop several yards from the porch. "Katherine Flynn, who's asking?" She replied, her voice nearly lost in the storm. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, leading his horse closer. He was tall, with rain-soaked dark hair peeking from beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Name's Hank Nathans, madam. I believe I have some information about your husband." Katherine's grip tightened on the porch railing. "Henry, is he all right? Is he coming home?" Hank Nathans removed his hat, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind but handsome in a rugged way. His eyes, she couldn't quite tell their color in the dim light, held something between pity and discomfort. "Madam, I think it might be best if we talk inside." Katherine hesitated, then nodded. She hadn't invited a man into her home since Henry left, but the storm was worsening, and this stranger carried news she both craved and dreaded. Inside, she lit a lamp while Hank hung his dripping coat and hat near the door. In the soft light, she could see he was younger than she initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, only a few years older than herself. His eyes were a clear hazel that seemed to catch the lamplight. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Flynn," he said, declining her offer of coffee. "I met your husband in Denver." He was celebrating quite extensively at the gaming tables. Katherine's throat tightened. "Gambling, of course." He mentioned he had a wife waiting in Willow Creek, said he'd struck it rich and wouldn't be returning. Hank paused, his expression grim. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of such news, but Henry joined a party heading to California. They left 3 days ago." The words struck Katherine like physical blows. Henry had abandoned her. After 2 years of marriage, of struggling to build their life together on this harsh frontier, he'd simply left. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I was heading this way anyhow. Seemed only right to let you know the truth instead of waiting for a letter that won't come." Hank shifted uncomfortably. "I've got some supplies on my horse." "Not much, but enough to help for a spell if you'll accept them." Katherine's pride warred with practicality. Her pantry held little more than dried beans and some flour. "Why would you help a stranger?" Hank's gaze met her squarely. "My ma raised me better than to leave a lady in distress, especially with a storm like this brewing. I can camp in your barn tonight and be on my way at first light if that's agreeable." Katherine nodded slowly. "The barn will be fine, Mr. Nathans." After he'd retrieved his saddlebags and gone to settle his horse, Katherine sank onto a kitchen chair, finally allowing the tears to come. Henry was gone. The signs had been there for months: his restlessness, his complaints about farm life, his increasingly frequent trips to town. Yet somehow, she'd convinced herself he would change, that their love was enough. Now she sat alone in their half-built dream, with winter's remnants still clinging to the Colorado soil and a stranger sleeping in her barn. Morning brought clear skies, and the realization that Katherine's situation was even more precarious than she'd allowed herself to acknowledge. The vegetable garden she'd started was weeks from yielding anything substantial, and the small amount of money hidden in the flour canister wouldn't last long. A knock at the door revealed Hank, hat in hand. "Morning, Mrs. Flynn." I noticed your corral fence needs mending and theirs wood needs chopping. Before I head out, I'd be glad to take care of those things for you." Katherine studied him warily. Men didn't offer help without expecting something in return. That was a lesson hard learned during her 24 years. "That's kind but unnecessary. I can manage." "No doubt you can," he agreed with surprising sincerity. "But 4 hands make lighter work than 2. I've nowhere pressing to be today." After a moment's hesitation, Katherine agreed. They worked side by side through the morning, Hank repairing the fence while she tended to the few chickens and single milk cow that comprised her livestock. When he finished with the fence, he split enough firewood to last a month. By midday, Katherine found herself setting 2 plates at the table, a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of her preserved peaches. As they ate, she gathered her courage to ask the question that had haunted her since his arrival. "Did Henry send any message for me? Any word at all?" Hank set down his fork, his expression troubled. "No specific message, madam," he did say. He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "Please, whatever it is, I need to hear it." He said farm life wasn't for him, and neither was being tied down to one woman. Hank's voice was gentle, but the words cut deep nonetheless. Katherine nodded, blinking rapidly. "I see." She pushed food around her plate. "And what brings you to Willow Creek, Mr. Nathans? You mentioned you were heading this way." "Looking for work, mostly." "I've been drifting since the war ended. Heard there might be opportunities at Fort Lyon." "What sort of work do you do?" "Whatever needs doing." His smile softened his features. "I'm good with horses, decent with cattle, worked as a ranch hand, done some scouting for the Army. Even tried my hand at bounty hunting for a spell, though that didn't sit right with me." Katherine considered this. "The Hendersons about 3 miles east are looking for help with their spring cattle drive. I'll keep that in mind." Hank finished his meal and stood. "Mrs. Flynn, I want to be forthright with you. Your situation here concerns me, a woman alone." "I'm not the first widow on the frontier, Mr. Nathans." "You're not a widow, you're abandoned," she supplied bluntly. "Yes, I'm aware, but the distinction makes little practical difference. What I mean to say is, I'd feel better if I stayed another day or 2, just to help get things in order before I move on." He gestured vaguely. "That barn roof needs patching and your garden could use some attention." Katherine should have refused. Propriety demanded she send this stranger on his way, but practicality and perhaps a fear of solitude she wasn't ready to acknowledge made her nod. 2 days, Mr. Nathans. Then you really must go." 2 days stretched into 4, then a week. Hank proved himself not only capable but industrious, repairing things Henry had neglected for months. He slept in the barn, took his meals with Katherine, and kept a respectful distance that gradually lessened as they grew accustomed to each other's company. On the 8th day, while they worked together to expand her vegetable garden, Katherine finally asked the question that had been troubling her. "Why are you still here, Mr. Nathans? Surely you have better prospects than helping a woman you barely know with chores." Hank paused, wiping sweat from his brow with his shirt sleeve. "Truthfully, I'm not entirely sure myself." He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "Maybe I'm making up for past mistakes. Maybe I just recognize someone who could use a friend. Is that what we are, friends?" "I'd like to think so, Mrs. Flynn." Katherine looked away, suddenly flustered. "Katherine," she said softly, "if we're friends, you should call me Katherine." "Katherine," he repeated, his voice warming the simple syllables. "Then I'm Hank, not Mr. Nathans." That evening, a neighbor, Mrs. Watson, arrived with her husband. Their barely concealed curiosity about Hank's presence was evident, though Katherine introduced him simply as a hired hand passing through. After they left, Katherine sighed heavily. "By tomorrow, half the county will be speculating about us." Hank frowned. "I hadn't considered how my presence might affect your reputation. People will talk regardless. They've likely been gossiping since Henry left." She busied herself with the dishes. "Still, perhaps it is time you moved on. The Hendersons would probably still welcome the help." Hank was quiet for a long moment. "You're right, of course. I'll speak to them tomorrow." The following morning, Katherine woke to find Hank already gone. A note on the kitchen table explained he'd ridden to the Henderson ranch and would return by evening to collect his few belongings. Katherine tried to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest as she went about her chores. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered once again. Katherine found herself on the porch, watching the road, just as she had that night Hank arrived. When the rain began to fall and there was still no sign of him, she told herself the disappointment she felt was merely concern for his welfare in the storm. The sound of hoofbeats finally came after sunset, and Katherine had to restrain herself from rushing out into the downpour. Hank appeared soaked and mudded, leading his horse into the barn. When he finally came to the house, his expression was unreadable. "You're back," Katherine said needlessly, handing him a towel. "Henderson hired me," Hank confirmed, removing his dripping hat. "Wants me to help with the spring roundup and drive. That's wonderful." She turned away, busying herself with the coffee pot. "When do you start?" "2 days from now." He hesitated. "Katherine, there's something else. I spoke with Sheriff Miller in town after leaving Henderson's." Katherine tensed. About your situation, about Henry." Hank sat at the table, his expression troubled. "The sheriff mentioned there've been rumors about Henry's dealings in Denver. Nothing concrete, but concerning." "What sort of rumors?" "That he might have been involved in some unsavory business, possibly even illegal. The sheriff thinks that might explain his sudden departure." Katherine sank into a chair, her mind racing. "I always wondered where the money came from for this place. He never would give me straight answers." She looked up at Hank. "Do you think I'm in danger?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm not comfortable leaving you alone until we know more. You're suggesting you stay here even while working for the Hendersons? It's only 3 miles. I could easily ride back and forth." He leaned forward earnestly. "Katherine, I know how this must look to your neighbors, but your safety matters more than gossip." Katherine knew she should refuse. Yet the thought of facing the uncertain future alone, possibly with Henry's mysterious business looming over her, was terrifying. "My reputation may already be beyond salvaging," she said finally. "You can stay, Hank." But she hesitated. "Perhaps we should be clear about our arrangement with the neighbors. Tell them you're renting the room above the kitchen. That might quell some of the talk." Hank agreed, though they both knew the arrangement would still raise eyebrows in the small community. That night, as Katherine prepared the small room that had once been intended as a nursery, she wondered what her life had become. 2 weeks ago, she'd been a respectable married woman waiting for her husband's return. Now she was. What? Not quite a widow, not quite abandoned, with a man who was not quite a stranger taking up residence in her home. The next day brought Mrs. Watson back, this time alone and clearly on a mission of reconnaissance. Katherine received her in the kitchen, where she was preparing preserves from the last of the winter stores. "We missed you at Sunday service yesterday," Mrs. Watson said, accepting a cup of tea. "And I couldn't help noticing your hired man is still about." Katherine kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Nathans has taken employment with the Hendersons, but he's renting the room upstairs while he works for them. It's a convenient arrangement for both of us." Mrs. Watson's eyebrows rose. "Is it indeed? And have you had any word from Henry?" "No," Katherine said shortly, "and I don't expect to." "Oh," Mrs. Watson leaned forward eagerly. "Has something happened?" Katherine considered her options. The truth would eventually come out, and perhaps controlling the narrative was better than allowing speculation to flourish. "Henry has gone to California. He will not be returning." Mrs. Watson's hand flew to her chest in theatrical shock. "Oh, my dear, left you all alone, has he? How dreadful." Katherine fought the urge to show the older woman the door. "Yes, well, life continues. I'm managing the farm as best I can." "But surely you can't mean to stay here, a woman alone. Perhaps your family back east." "I have no family back east, as you well know," Katherine interrupted. "This is my home, Mrs. Watson. I intend to keep it." After Mrs. Watson departed, laden with fresh gossip, Katherine found Hank repairing a harness in the barn. He looked up as she entered, concern evident in his expression. "That woman's tongue will be wagging faster than a dog's tail in fly season," he observed. "You all right?" Katherine nodded, then unexpectedly found herself fighting tears. "It's just making it real," saying the words aloud. Hank set aside his work and approached her, stopping just short of touching her. "Katherine," whatever he intended to say was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. They both moved to the barn door to see 3 men approaching, the center rider instantly recognizable to Katherine. "Sheriff Miller," she murmured, "and I don't recognize the others." "U.S. Marshals, by the look of them," Hank said grimly. "Stay here." He stepped outside to meet the men while Katherine remained in the doorway, her heart pounding. After a brief exchange, Hank waved her over. "Mrs. Flynn," Sheriff Miller nodded politely. "This is Marshal Edwards and Deputy Marshal Reynolds. They'd like to ask you some questions about your husband." The older of the 2 strangers, a stern-faced man with graying temples, spoke. "Mrs. Flynn, when did you last see Henry Flynn?" "Nearly a month ago now. He left for Denver on business." "And what business was that exactly?" Katherine hesitated. "I don't know. Henry kept his financial matters private." The marshals exchanged glances. "Mrs. Flynn," Edwards said carefully, "are you aware that your husband was involved with a counterfeiting operation based in Denver?" The world seemed to tilt beneath Katherine's feet. "Counterfeiting," she repeated weakly. "Yes, madam, we've been tracking this ring for some time." "Your husband was identified as one of the distributors. He would pass the false currency in various towns throughout the territory." Hank moved closer to Katherine, his presence steadying. "What exactly are you looking for here, Marshal?" "Information, primarily." "Mrs. Flynn, we need to know if your husband mentioned any names, locations, or if he left behind any materials related to this operation." Katherine shook her head numbly. "No, nothing like that. He never. I had no idea." The younger marshal was watching her closely. "This property, was it purchased recently?" "About 2 years ago, shortly after we married." "And the funds for that purchase?" Katherine's stomach clenched as understanding dawned. "It was Henry's money. He said it was from investments back east." The marshal nodded grimly. "Mrs. Flynn, I need to be clear about something. If this property was purchased with counterfeit money or proceeds from illegal activities, the federal government could have grounds to seize it." "What?" Katherine gasped. "But I knew nothing about any of this. This is my home." Hank stepped forward, his posture protective. "Surely there's a distinction between innocent parties and those knowingly involved." Marshal Edwards sighed. "It's complicated, legally speaking. For now, we're just gathering information. Mrs. Flynn, we'd like to search the house and outbuildings with your permission." Katherine nodded numbly, and for the next 2 hours, the marshals methodically went through every inch of the property. They found nothing incriminating, much to her relief, but the knowledge that her home, possibly her very livelihood, hung in the balance was devastating. After the lawmen departed, promising to return if they had further questions, Katherine sat heavily at the kitchen table. "Everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie," she said quietly. "My marriage, this farm, all of it built on criminal activity." Hank sat across from her. "You couldn't have known, Katherine, couldn't I?" She laughed bitterly. "The signs were there. The unexplained absences, the sudden influxes of cash, his reluctance to bank our money. I chose not to see them because I wanted to believe in the life we were building." "What will you do now?" Katherine raised her chin determinedly. "What I've already decided to do. Stay and fight for what's mine. If the government wants this land, they'll have to prove Henry bought it with ill-gotten gains, and even then, I'll argue my case as an innocent spouse." Hank studied her with newfound respect. "You're a remarkable woman, Katherine Flynn." "I'm a survivor, Mr. Nathans. I've had to be." That night, Katherine lay awake long after the household had settled into silence. The revelation about Henry's criminal activities had shaken her to her core, yet somehow it also provided a twisted sort of closure. It explained so much his secretiveness, his frequent travels, his ultimate abandonment. It hadn't been about her failure as a wife, but his choices as a criminal, and then there was Hank. His presence in the room below hers was oddly comforting, even as it complicated her already precarious situation. She'd known him barely 2 weeks, yet he'd become her most steadfast ally in this crisis. What did that say about her judgment after her catastrophic misreading of Henry? The next morning, Hank departed early for his first day working at the Henderson Ranch, promising to return by evening. Katherine threw herself into physical labor, attacking the vegetable garden with grim determination. The exertion helped clear her mind, and by midday, she'd formulated the beginnings of a plan. If the government seized her property, she would need alternatives. The 20 acres of land included good pasture that could support more livestock than her single cow and few chickens. With additional animals, she could generate income beyond mere subsistence. But acquiring livestock required capital she didn't have, unless… Katherine wiped dirt from her hands and headed for the barn. In the far corner, beneath loose floorboards, was a small metal box Henry had thought she knew nothing about. She discovered it months ago, but had respected his privacy fool that she was and never looked inside. Now she pried up the boards and retrieved the box. Inside, she found nearly $300 in cash, a substantial sum. Her first instinct was to recoil. Was this counterfeit money? But closer examination revealed these were well-worn bills, not the crisp new notes counterfeiters would produce. This was probably Henry's legitimate savings, or at least, money that had been in circulation long enough to be untraceable. Katherine returned the money to its hiding place, her mind racing. With these funds, she could purchase additional livestock and perhaps hire occasional help with the heavier farm work. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a start. When Hank returned that evening, dusty but satisfied with his day's work, Katherine shared her discoveries and plans. "It's a sound idea," he agreed as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. "Henderson mentioned he might be willing to sell a few head of cattle after the spring calving. I could speak to him about it. I would appreciate that." Katherine hesitated, then added, "Hank, I've been thinking about our arrangement. The Hendersons' bunkhouse has space. Perhaps it would be better for appearances' sake if you stayed there instead." Hank was quiet for a long moment. "Is that what you want, Katherine?" She couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. "It's what's proper." "I see." His voice was carefully neutral. "And if the marshals return, or if someone connected to Henry's criminal activities comes looking for something they believe he might have hidden here?" "I can't base my decisions on fear," Katherine said, though the thought had indeed occurred to her. "And I can't allow my reputation to be completely destroyed, not if I intend to stay in this community." Hank nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. I'll speak to Henderson tomorrow about using the bunkhouse." The sudden distance between them felt vast and cold, though they sat merely feet apart. Katherine wanted to retract her words, but knew they were the sensible course of action. Her life had already been upended once by a man. She couldn't allow herself to become dependent on another, no matter how kind or honorable he seemed. The next day, Hank departed with his few belongings, and Katherine found herself truly alone for the first time since his arrival. The house seemed unnaturally quiet without his presence. She threw herself into work, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest. 3 days passed with no sign of Hank, though she knew he was just a few miles away at the Henderson Ranch. On the 4th day, as Katherine was returning from collecting eggs, she spotted a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Her heart leapt foolishly before she realized it wasn't Hank, but Sheriff Miller. The lawman dismounted with a grave expression that immediately set Katherine on edge. "Mrs. Flynn," he greeted her. "I've had some news I thought you should hear directly from me rather than through town gossip. Has something happened?" The marshals caught up with a member of the counterfeiting ring in Pueblo, man named Collins. Under questioning, he revealed some information about your husband. The sheriff hesitated. It seems Henry was more deeply involved than initially thought. He wasn't just distributing false currency, he was one of the principal engravers. Catherine's knees weakened and she sank onto the porch steps. I see. There's more, I'm afraid. Collins claims the ring had a falling out. There was missing money, accusations of betrayal, he thinks. The sheriff removed his hat, a gesture of respect that chilled Katherine to the bone. He thinks Henry might have been killed by the others. The world seemed to still around her. Killed? It's not confirmed, Sheriff Miller hastened to add. But Collins says Henry was planning to flee with a significant amount of their money, if that's true. They would have stopped him, Katherine finished numbly. Yes, madam, I'm sorry to bring such news. After the sheriff departed, Katherine sat motionless on the porch, trying to process this latest revelation. Henry, the man she'd married, loved, built a life with might well be dead, murdered by his criminal associates. She should feel grief, shock, horror. Instead, there was only a strange, detached numbness. The sound of approaching hoofbeats roused her from this stupor. Hank was riding hard toward the house, concern etched on his features. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. I just heard, he said, taking in her pale face. Sheriff Miller told Henderson, who told me, Katherine, I'm so sorry. For what? She asked dully. That my husband was not just a counterfeiter, but apparently an important one. That he likely stole from his criminal partners and got himself killed for it. Or that I'm such a fool I never suspected any of it. You're not a fool, Hank said firmly, sitting beside her on the steps. Henry was the fool for his choices and for leaving someone like you behind. Katherine turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time since his arrival. His hazel eyes held genuine concern, his face open and honest in a way Henry's never had been. Why do you care, Hank? Why did you ever care about what happened to me? He looked away, his jaw working as though wrestling with his answer. Because from that first night, seeing you standing in the rain, waiting for a man who didn't deserve you, something inside me recognized something in you. He met her gaze again. Strength, dignity, goodness, things I've been searching for most of my life, Katherine's breath caught. Hank, I know the timing is all wrong, he continued hurriedly. You're still legally married, even if Henry is, even with everything that's happened. And I'm just a drifter with nothing to offer except a pair of willing hands and a heart that's never felt quite like this before. The confession hung in the air between them, too raw and honest to be ignored or denied. Katherine found herself reaching for his hand almost without conscious thought. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't need to say anything, he assured her. I just needed you to know that whatever happens next with the Marshalls, with the property, with everything, you're not alone unless you want to be. That night, Hank returned to the Henderson ranch despite Katherine's offer to let him stay. His scruples, he explained, wouldn't allow him to do anything that might further compromise her reputation, especially now. The following weeks brought gradual adjustments to Katherine's new reality. The Marshalls returned with more questions but no definitive news about Henry's fate. The investigation into the counterfeiting ring continued, with occasional arrests reported in Denver newspapers. Hank remained at the Henderson ranch but visited Katherine's farm frequently, helping with repairs and heavier work. Their relationship settled into a cautious friendship, the undercurrent of deeper feelings acknowledged but not acted upon. Spring advanced into early summer, and Katherine's expanded garden began to flourish. With Hank's help, she purchased 4 heifers from Henderson and began building up a small herd. The physical labor left her exhausted each night, but it was a purposeful exhaustion that brought dreamless sleep instead of anxious rumination. One warm June evening, as they sat on the porch after a day spent repairing fences, Hank broke their comfortable silence with unexpected news. Marshal Edwards came by Henderson's place today asking for me. Katherine stiffened. What did he want? To let me know they found Henry. Her heart seemed to stop. Dead, Hank nodded grimly, in an abandoned mining shack outside Central City, been there a while apparently. They identified him by papers in his possession and a distinctive ring he wore. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she processed this information. "So I am a widow, then?" "Yes." Hank hesitated. "There's more. They found a considerable sum of money with him, nearly $20,000. The marshals believe it was the stolen counterfeiting proceeds Collins mentioned. What happens to it? It's evidence now. But Edwards said that once the case is closed, there might be a reward for information leading to the recovery of stolen funds. As Henry's widow, you could have a claim to that, minus any amounts that can be proven were derived from illegal activities." Katherine shook her head slowly. "I don't want money tainted by crime. Whatever happens with it happens." Hank studied her with evident admiration. "Most folks wouldn't be so quick to turn away from that kind of sum. Most folks haven't learned the hard way that money isn't worth much if your peace of mind goes with it." She looked out over her modest farm. "This land, what I can build here with honest work, that's worth more to me than Henry's blood money." They sat in silence as twilight deepened around them, the implications of Henry's confirmed death settling between them like a physical presence. "What will you do now?" Hank finally asked. "Continue as I have been. Build this farm into something that can sustain me." She glanced at him. "And you, will you stay with the Hendersons?" "For now." He hesitated. "Katherine, I know it's far too soon to speak of such things, but when an appropriate time has passed, I'd like to call on you properly." The directness of his statement brought a flush to her cheeks. "You mean as a suitor?" "Yes." His gaze held hers steadily. "If you'd be amenable to that." Katherine considered this. By the customs of their time, a year of mourning would be expected, even for a marriage that had ended as disastrously as hers. Yet the thought of waiting that long to explore the feelings growing between them seemed suddenly intolerable. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "a shorter period of mourning would be acceptable given the unusual circumstances of Henry's departure and death." Hank's expression brightened. "Perhaps. What would you consider appropriate?" 3 months, she decided. That would be until September. By then, the truth about Henry will be common knowledge, and people will have had time to adjust to it. "September," Hank repeated, a smile slowly spreading across his face. "I can wait until September." The summer months passed in a blur of activity. Katherine threw herself into farm work with renewed purpose, while Hank divided his time between the Henderson ranch and helping her with the heavier tasks. They maintained a careful propriety in their interactions, mindful of the watchful eyes of neighbors, but their growing attachment was evident to anyone paying attention. In late July, Marshal Edwards returned with official confirmation of Henry's death and the closure of the investigation into his counterfeiting activities. Katherine received the news with composed dignity, though privately she felt nothing but relief that this chapter of her life was finally ending. "The property appears to have been purchased with legitimate funds," Edwards informed her. "Henry was clever enough to keep his illegal earnings separate from his visible assets. The farm is yours free and clear." As the marshal was leaving, he added one final piece of information. "The reward money I mentioned, the department has decided to award you a portion of it. $5,000 for your cooperation in the investigation. It's clean money, Mrs. Flynn, not connected to the counterfeit operation." Katherine was stunned by the amount. "That's very generous." "It's deserved," Edwards replied firmly. "And between us, it's a fraction of what was recovered. The government comes out well ahead." After the marshal's departure, Katherine sat at her kitchen table, staring at the bank draft he'd left. $5,000 enough to transform her struggling homestead into a viable ranch, to hire proper help, to secure her future independently. When Hank arrived that evening and heard the news, his reaction surprised her. "This changes things for you," he said quietly. "With this kind of financial security, you don't need assistance." Katherine studied him carefully. "Are you suggesting I no longer need you, Hank?" He wouldn't meet her eyes. "I'm suggesting you have options now that you didn't have before. And you think that changes how I feel about you." This brought his gaze back to hers, searching. "Does it?" Katherine reached across the table to take his hand. "The only thing that's changed is that now I can offer a partnership of equals. I'm not looking for a rescuer, Hank, I never was." The tension eased from his shoulders. "And I never wanted to be one. Just to be by your side however you'd have me." August brought sweltering heat and the ripening of Katherine's garden. With the reward money safely deposited in the Willow Creek Bank, she began making improvements to the farm, hiring 2 local boys to help with daily chores, purchasing additional cattle, and commissioning repairs to the house itself. Hank remained at the Henderson Ranch but visited almost daily. Their time together took on a sweet anticipation as September approached, their conversations deepening as they shared more of their pasts and dreams for the future. Katherine learned that Hank had fought for the Union in the war, had lost his parents to influenza shortly after returning home to Missouri, and had been drifting westward ever since, seeking something he couldn't quite name. He learned about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her brief stint as a schoolteacher before marrying Henry, and her private dreams of someday raising children in the wide open spaces of the West. As September 1st dawned, Katherine woke with a fluttering anticipation in her stomach. This was the day they had agreed Hank could officially begin courting her. What exactly that would mean, she wasn't certain, but the prospect filled her with a nervous excitement she hadn't felt in years. Hank arrived at mid-morning, freshly shaven and wearing his best shirt. In his hand was a small bouquet of wildflowers, nothing fancy, just simple prairie blooms gathered with evident care. "Miss Katherine," he greeted her formally, though his eyes twinkled. "I've come to request the honor of escorting you to the church social this Sunday." Katherine accepted the flowers with a smile. "I would be delighted, Mr. Nathans." The church social marked Katherine's first public appearance as a widow rather than an abandoned wife, and she felt the curious eyes of the community upon her as she entered on Hank's arm. "Mrs. Watson bustled over immediately, her expression a mixture of sympathy and avid curiosity. "My dear Katherine, how brave of you to join us so soon after your bereavement. And Mr. Nathans, still in our community, I see." "Mr. Nathans has been a great help to me during this difficult time," Katherine replied evenly. "As have many in this community." The subtle reminder of communal obligation had the desired effect of tempering Mrs. Watson's more intrusive questions, and the afternoon proceeded pleasantly enough. Katherine was surprised to find genuine condolences offered by many of her neighbors, along with practical offers of assistance with the farm. "People are kinder than I expected," she remarked to Hank as they drove home in his wagon. "I thought there would be more judgment about Henry's activities." "Folks can distinguish between a man's actions and his wife's character," Hank replied. "And you've earned their respect these past months, working that land on your own, never asking for charity." "Not entirely on my own," she reminded him softly. "I've had help." Their courtship progressed with deliberate care through September and into October. Hank called on Katherine twice weekly, taking her for drives in the countryside, to occasional dinners in town, and once to a traveling show that passed through Fort Lyon. He was unfailingly respectful, never presuming more than she offered, though the attraction between them grew increasingly difficult to ignore. By late October, with winter's approach looming, Hank raised a subject they'd been carefully avoiding. "I've given notice at Henderson's," he told Katherine as they walked along the creek that bordered her property. "The cattle drive is finished and they're reducing staff for the winter months." Katherine's heart sank. "Will you be moving on then?" "That depends," he said carefully, stopping to face her. "Katherine, I need to be direct. These past months have been the happiest of my life. Being near you, watching you rebuild your life with such courage and determination, has only confirmed what I suspected from the first, that you're the woman I've been searching for without even knowing it." He took her hands in his expression earnest. "I know it's still early by conventional standards. You've been a widow less than 3 months. But life out here doesn't always allow for convention, and I can't bear the thought of leaving without telling you how I feel. Catherine's pulse quickened. "And how do you feel, Hank?" "I love you," he said simply. "I want to build a life with you here or wherever you choose. I don't have much to offer except my hands, my heart, and a promise to honor and cherish you for all my days." Tears welled in Catherine's eyes. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am." He squeezed her hands gently. "Not necessarily right away. We could have a longer engagement if you prefer, give the neighbors less to gossip about. But I need to know if there's a future for us before I decide my next steps." Katherine didn't hesitate. The answer had been forming in her heart for months, waiting only for this moment of asking. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Yes, I will marry you, Hank Nathans." His face broke into a smile of such joy that it took her breath away. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward and kissed her their first kiss, sweet and tender and full of promise. They agreed to marry in December after the fall harvest was complete, but before the worst of winter set in. This gave the community time to adjust to the idea, though there were still whispers about the hasty timeline. Katherine found she cared little for such talk. At 24, with one disastrous marriage behind her, she had learned to trust her own judgment about what brought her happiness. Preparations for the wedding were simple. Katherine sewed a new dress of deep blue wool, more practical than the traditional white but still festive. Hank moved his few belongings into the barn loft, where he would stay until the ceremony, preserving Catherine's reputation while allowing him to help with the daily operation of the farm. The day before the wedding, an unexpected visitor arrived. Marshall Edwards, his official business long concluded, had detoured to Willow Creek on personal business. "I wanted to see how you were faring, Mrs. Flynn," he explained, accepting a cup of coffee in Catherine's kitchen. "And to bring you this." He placed a small package on the table. Inside was a man's wedding ring, Henry's ring, the one that had helped identify his body. "I thought you might want it," Edwards said awkwardly. "As a remembrance, perhaps." Katherine studied the ring thoughtfully. "Thank you for the sentiment, Marshall, but I have no desire to remember that marriage. Henry made his choices and I've made mine." She handed the ring back. "Perhaps it could be sold and the proceeds donated to the church orphan fund." Edwards nodded, impressed by her resolution. "I understand you're remarrying tomorrow," Katherine confirmed, "to a good man who has proven his character through actions rather than words." "Nathans." When she nodded, Edwards smiled. "I made some inquiries about him after our first meeting. He has a solid reputation. Fought with distinction in the war, no criminal history, known to be reliable and hardworking. You've chosen well, Mrs. Flynn." "I believe I have," Katherine agreed. "And soon it will be Mrs. Nathans." The wedding took place in Willow Creek's small church, attended by a modest gathering of neighbors and friends from the surrounding farms and ranches. Catherine's blue dress complemented her eyes, and Hank cut a handsome figure in a new suit purchased for the occasion. As they exchanged vows, Katherine felt none of the youthful nervousness that had characterized her first wedding. In its place was a steady certainty, a deep knowledge that this union was founded on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love. The celebration afterward was held at the farm, with tables set up in the yard and simple but abundant food prepared by Katherine and several neighbor women. As the afternoon progressed into evening, Katherine found herself momentarily alone, watching the gathering from the porch steps. "Having second thoughts, Mrs. Nathans?" Hank's voice came from behind her as he joined her on the steps. "Not a single one," she assured him, leaning against his shoulder. "I was just thinking about that night you rode in during the rainstorm, how different my life is now from what I expected then." "Better or worse, infinitely better." She turned to face him. "That night I thought my life was ending, instead it was just beginning." Hank's arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer. "We have a good foundation here, land, livestock, a home, but more importantly we have each other. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." "Together," Katherine agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. Winter passed in a contented blur for the newlyweds. The small room above the kitchen was abandoned in favor of the main bedroom, where they discovered the deep physical connection that complemented their emotional bond. Days were filled with the shared work of maintaining the farm through the harsh Colorado winter. Nights were for conversation, laughter, and the intimate exploration of their new relationship. By spring, Katherine had news to share. "I'm with child," she told Hank one April morning as they watched the sunrise from the porch, the same porch where he had found her waiting in the rain nearly a year before, his face transformed with wonder and joy. "A baby, you're certain?" "As certain as a woman can be." She smiled, placing his hand over her still flat stomach. "By my calculations, we should welcome our child in late November." Hank pulled her into a gentle embrace, mindful of her condition though there was no physical evidence of it yet. "Katherine Nathans, you have made me the happiest man in Colorado territory." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and early fall. Katherine remained active in running the farm, though Hank insisted on hiring additional help to ensure she didn't overtax herself. By October, her rounded belly made her condition obvious to all, and the community responded with the practical support typical of frontier settlements: hand-me-down baby clothes, offers of assistance after the birth, and a steady stream of advice from experienced mothers. On a crisp November evening, with the first snow dusting the distant mountains, Katherine went into labor. The midwife was summoned from town, and Hank was banished to the kitchen to pace anxiously while the women handled the business of bringing new life into the world. After 6 hours of labor, relatively quick for a first child, the midwife assured her Katherine delivered a healthy baby boy. When Hank was finally permitted to enter the bedroom, he found his wife tired but radiant, cradling a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Meet your son," Katherine said softly, lifting the blanket to reveal a tiny face with Hank's chin and Katherine's clear blue eyes. Hank approached cautiously, as though afraid his rough hands might somehow damage this miniature miracle. When Katherine placed the baby in his arms, his expression of awe and tenderness brought tears to her eyes. "Hello, little man," he whispered. "I'm your pa." They named him William Henry Nathans William for Katherine's grandfather. Henry not for her first husband but for Hank himself, whose given name was actually Henry, though no one had called him that in years. The following spring, as William grew sturdy and alert, Katherine and Hank expanded their operations, purchasing adjacent land when it became available and increasing their cattle herd. The reward money, carefully invested, provided security while they built the ranch into a sustainable business. 2 years after William's birth, Katherine gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Hank's mother. The family was complete, and the homestead that had once seemed like the site of Katherine's greatest disappointment had transformed into the center of her greatest joy. On the 5th anniversary of the rainy night when Hank had first ridden onto her property, Katherine found him sitting on the porch steps, watching their children play in the yard. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling beside him. Hank smiled, taking her hand in his. "I was thinking about how close I came to riding past this place that night. I almost took the South Fork at the crossroads, which would have bypassed Willow Creek entirely. Why didn't you? Something told me to go north instead. Call it instinct, call it fate." He squeezed her hand. "Best decision I ever made, even if I didn't know it at the time." Katherine leaned against his shoulder, contentment warming her despite the cool evening air. "And to think I almost sent you away." "You did send me away," he reminded her with a chuckle. "Several times, as I recall. Yet you kept coming back. I couldn't seem to help myself." His expression grew serious. "You were standing in the rain, waiting for a man who didn't deserve you, and something in me just recognized you, like I'd been looking for you all my life without knowing it." Katherine turned her face up to his. "I'm glad you found me." "I'm glad you let me stay," he replied, bending to kiss her softly. Inside the house, William called for his mother, and the moment was broken. But as Katherine rose to attend to their son, She paused to look back at her husband, this good, steadfast man who had ridden into her life when she needed him most, and refused to leave despite all sensible reasons to do so. "I love you, Hank Nathans," she said simply. His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "And I love you, Katherine Nathans, yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows." As she went to their children, Katherine carried that promise with her, knowing it was the foundation upon which they had built this life, a life richer and more fulfilling than she could ever have imagined on that rainy night when a stranger's arrival had changed her destiny forever.